The fluorescent lights of Henderson's Market cast their familiar harsh glow across the polished linoleum floors, creating an almost sterile atmosphere that Margaret Chen had grown accustomed to during her weekly shopping trips. At 72, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to navigate the world with measured steps, her weathered hands gripping the red shopping cart that had become as much a walking aid as a vessel for groceries. The morning crowd was thinner than usual, mostly retirees like herself and a few parents with young children in tow, their voices creating a gentle murmur that mixed with the soft hum of refrigeration units and the distant beeping of checkout scanners. Margaret paused in the cereal aisle, squinting at the overwhelming array of colorful boxes that seemed to multiply with each passing year. Her doctor had recommended more fiber, but the choices felt endless and confusing. As she reached for a box of bran flakes on a higher shelf, a wave of dizziness swept over her like a sudden tide. The sensation was subtle at first, just a light-headed feeling that she attributed to standing up too quickly from her bent position. She steadied herself against the cart, taking a deep breath as she had learned to do when these moments occurred. What she didn't notice, 3 aisles over in the produce section, was a familiar figure methodically selecting apples with the same careful attention he might give to choosing the perfect take for a movie scene. Tom Hanks, dressed in a simple navy sweater and khakis, moved through the store with the practiced invisibility that came from decades of trying to blend into everyday life. His salt and pepper hair was slightly tousled, and he wore the kind of comfortable shoes that spoke of someone who valued practicality over style. To most observers, he was just another middle-aged man doing his shopping, perhaps a grandfather picking up ingredients for a family dinner. Before we dive deeper into this story, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel. That way, you'll always stay updated with our upcoming videos and continue discovering more fascinating stories. Now let's begin. Margaret's second wave of dizziness hit her with frightening intensity as she attempted to place the cereal box in her cart. The world seemed to tilt sideways, colors bleeding together like watercolors in the rain. Her knees buckled without warning, and the box tumbled from her grasp, hitting the floor with a hollow thud that seemed to echo through her consciousness. She felt herself falling, her hands reaching out instinctively for something, anything, to break her descent. The cart rolled away slightly, wheels squeaking in protest, leaving her grasping at empty air before everything went dark. The sound of her collapse carried through the store like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of concern spreading from aisle to aisle. A young mother pushing her toddler in a cart gasped and immediately reached for her phone. An elderly man nearby shuffled closer, his own mobility limited, but his concern genuine. The store's ambient noise seemed to pause for a heartbeat, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Tom heard the commotion before he saw it. Years of living in the public eye had given him an almost supernatural awareness of disturbances in normal patterns, a survival skill developed from countless encounters with fans and paparazzi. But this sound was different, urgent and genuine, stripped of the manufactured drama that often surrounded his daily life. He set down the apple he had been examining and moved toward the source of the disturbance with purposeful strides, his expression shifting from casual shopper to concerned citizen in the span of seconds. As he rounded the corner into the cereal aisle, the scene unfolded before him like a tableau from one of his films, but this was real, immediate, and demanded action rather than performance. Margaret lay unconscious on the cold linoleum, her silver hair fanned out around her head like a halo, one arm stretched toward where her cart had been moments before. Her face was pale, almost translucent under the harsh lighting, and her breathing was shallow but steady. The box of bran flakes lay a few feet away, its contents scattered like confetti across the floor. The small crowd that had begun to gather parted instinctively as Tom approached, some recognizing him with wide eyes, and others simply sensing his natural authority in the moment. He knelt beside Margaret without hesitation, his knees protesting slightly against the hard floor as he positioned himself to assess her condition. His hands, which had signed countless autographs and shaken hands with presidents, now hovered carefully over this stranger, checking for signs of consciousness while being mindful not to move her unnecessarily. "Has anyone called 911?" he asked, his voice carrying the calm confidence that had made him America's most trusted actor. The young mother, who had been filming her toddler's reaction to the colorful cereal boxes, nodded, her phone already pressed to her ear as she spoke rapidly to the emergency dispatcher. Tom caught her eye and gave her a reassuring nod, the kind of subtle acknowledgement that said, "You're doing exactly the right thing," without needing words. Margaret's eyelids fluttered slightly, a sign that brought immediate relief to everyone watching. Tom leaned closer, his voice dropping to a gentle, conversational tone that seemed to create an intimate bubble around them despite the growing crowd of onlookers. "Ma'am, can you hear me? You're in Henderson's Market. You're safe, and help is on the way." His words were measured and clear, delivered with the same authenticity that had made audiences believe in everything, from a simple man with a box of chocolates to a castaway talking to a volleyball. The store manager, a harried-looking man in his 40s named Dave Kowalski, pushed through the crowd with the kind of nervous energy that came from having a celebrity and a medical emergency in his establishment simultaneously. His name tag was slightly crooked, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the store's aggressive air conditioning. "Mr. Hanks, sir, is there anything we can do? Should we clear the area? I can get some privacy barriers if you need them." Tom looked up at Dave with appreciation for his concern, but shook his head gently. "Let's just focus on keeping her comfortable until the paramedics arrive. Maybe you could ask people to give us some space, but don't make a big production of it." His tone was kind but firm, the voice of someone accustomed to managing situations while keeping everyone's dignity intact. Dave nodded gratefully and began quietly dispersing the crowd, asking people to continue their shopping while maintaining a respectful perimeter. Margaret's eyes opened slowly, confusion clouding her vision as she tried to process her surroundings. The ceiling tiles above her seemed to swim in and out of focus, and the concerned faces looking down at her felt like something from a dream. When her gaze finally settled on Tom, she blinked several times, certain that her fall had somehow transported her into some alternate reality where movie stars materialized in grocery store aisles. "I think I must have hit my head harder than I thought," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the store's ambient noise. "You look exactly like Tom Hanks." Her words carried a mixture of confusion and embarrassment, the kind of vulnerable honesty that comes when someone is caught completely off guard by circumstances beyond their control. Tom smiled, the same genuine expression that had graced movie screens for decades, but somehow more intimate and immediate in person. "Well, that's probably because I am Tom Hanks," he said with gentle humor, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that immediately put her at ease. "But more importantly, I'm just a guy who happened to be buying apples when you needed help. What's your name?" "Margaret," she managed, trying to sit up despite Tom's gentle but firm hand on her shoulder, encouraging her to stay still. "Margaret Chen. This is so embarrassing. I've never fainted in my life, and certainly not in front of someone famous." Her cheeks flushed with color, which Tom took as a good sign that her circulation was improving. The sound of sirens grew steadily louder as the paramedics navigated through the late morning traffic, their arrival promising professional medical care, but also the inevitable end of this strange, intimate encounter between a Hollywood legend and a woman who had simply been trying to buy cereal. Tom remained kneeling beside Margaret, his presence serving as both comfort and shield, against the curious stares of other shoppers who had begun to realize that something extraordinary was happening in aisle 7. Margaret's breathing had steadied considerably, and her color continued to improve. But Tom noticed the slight tremor in her hands that suggested either lingering effects from her fall or perhaps an underlying condition that had contributed to her collapse in the first place. He had learned through years of preparing for roles and working with actors dealing with various health challenges to recognize signs that might not be immediately obvious to casual observers. "Margaret, do you live alone?" he asked, his question prompted not by idle curiosity, but by genuine concern for what would happen to her after the immediate crisis passed. It was the kind of thoughtful inquiry that revealed his character beyond the public persona, showing a man who understood that true help often extended beyond the dramatic moment of rescue. "Yes," she admitted, her voice gaining strength as she became more alert. "My husband passed 2 years ago. My daughter lives in Seattle, and my son is stationed in Germany with the military. I manage fine on my own, usually." The last word carried the weight of someone who was beginning to question assumptions about her own independence that had sustained her through months of grief and adjustment. Tom nodded, understanding, recognizing in her tone the complex emotions that came with aging and the gradual shift from being the helper to sometimes needing help. "Everyone needs assistance sometimes, Margaret. There's no shame in that. The important thing is making sure you're okay." His words carried the wisdom of someone who had portrayed characters facing their own vulnerabilities and had learned something about grace in the process. The paramedics burst through the store's automatic doors with professional efficiency, their equipment cases rolling smoothly across the polished floor as they made their way to the cereal aisle. The lead paramedic, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and confident movements, immediately took charge of the scene while her partner began unpacking monitoring equipment. They worked around Tom with practiced ease, clearly accustomed to dealing with good Samaritans who were reluctant to step back from someone they had been helping. "Sir, thank you for staying with her," the lead paramedic said to Tom as she began her assessment of Margaret's vital signs. "Can you tell me what you observed when she collapsed?" Her professional demeanor didn't betray any recognition of who he was, a fact that Tom found refreshing and which allowed him to focus entirely on providing helpful information rather than managing celebrity dynamics. Tom described the fall with the same attention to detail he might bring to discussing a scene with a director, noting Margaret's position when she collapsed, the sounds she made, and the progression of her return to consciousness. His observations were clear and factual, the account of someone who had learned to notice and remember important details without embellishment or drama. As the paramedics worked, checking Margaret's blood pressure, pulse, and blood sugar levels, Tom found himself thinking about the strange randomness of the morning's events. He had come to Henderson's Market, as he did most Saturday mornings, seeking the simple pleasure of selecting his own groceries without fanfare. It was one of the few places where he could move through the world like any other person, focused on the mundane decisions of daily life, rather than the weight of public expectation. The paramedics completed their initial assessment with professional thoroughness, their instruments beeping and whirring as they gathered data about Margaret's condition. Her blood pressure was slightly elevated, which could have been from the stress of the situation or an underlying issue, and her blood sugar was lower than ideal, suggesting she might not have eaten breakfast before her shopping trip. The lead paramedic, whose name tag identified her as Sarah Rodriguez, explained her findings in terms that were both medically accurate and accessible to non-professionals. "Mrs. Chen, we'd like to transport you to the hospital for a more complete evaluation," Sarah said, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that came from years of managing medical emergencies. "You've had a syncopal episode, which is the medical term for fainting, and we want to make sure there's nothing more serious going on. It could be as simple as low blood sugar or dehydration, but it's better to be safe." Margaret's face showed the internal struggle between her desire to minimize the situation and her growing awareness that this might be more serious than she wanted to admit. "I feel much better now," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I probably just need to eat something and sit down for a while. I hate to be such a bother." Tom, who had moved slightly back to give the paramedics room to work, but remained within Margaret's line of sight, stepped forward again. "Margaret, you're not a bother to anyone. These folks are here because they want to help, just like I was. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is accept help when we need it." His words carried the weight of someone who had learned this lesson himself, perhaps through his own family experiences, or simply through the wisdom that comes with living authentically in the public eye. The second paramedic, a young man named Jake who had been quietly preparing the gurney, looked up at Tom with sudden recognition. His eyes widened slightly, and he opened his mouth as if to say something, then caught himself and returned his focus to his work. The moment passed so quickly that only Tom noticed it, and he gave Jake a subtle nod of acknowledgement that said, "I see you. But let's keep this about Margaret." Sarah helped Margaret sit up slowly, monitoring her reaction to the change in position. "How do you feel when you sit up? Any dizziness or nausea?" she asked, her hands ready to support Margaret if needed. The older woman took a moment to assess herself, moving with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to take her body's responses for granted. "I feel steady," Margaret said, though she gripped Sarah's arm for additional support. "But I suppose you're right about going to the hospital. I just worry about my car and my groceries and all the inconvenience." Her concerns revealed the practical mind of someone who had spent decades managing household details and who struggled with the idea of leaving loose ends unresolved. Tom had been thinking about exactly these issues while the paramedics worked. "What if I take care of your car and groceries?" he offered, his tone suggesting that this was the most natural thing in the world rather than an extraordinary gesture from a movie star. "I can follow the ambulance to the hospital and make sure everything is handled. You shouldn't have to worry about those details right now." The offer hung in the air for a moment, its kindness almost too much for Margaret to process. She looked at him with eyes that had seen decades of life's complications and small miracles, trying to reconcile the famous face with the genuine concern she saw there. "You would do that for a stranger?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not a stranger anymore, Margaret," Tom replied simply. "You're someone who needed help, and I happen to be here. That makes us connected in a way that matters." His words carried the authenticity that had made him beloved, not just as an actor, but as a person, the sense that he meant exactly what he said, without calculation or hidden agenda. The transition from the store's harsh fluorescent lighting to the natural daylight outside seemed to energize Margaret, though she remained on the paramedic's gurney as a precaution. The parking lot was busier now, with the late-morning shoppers arriving for their weekend errands, and several people had begun to take notice of the unusual scene unfolding near the ambulance. Tom walked alongside the gurney, carrying Margaret's purse and the few items she had managed to collect before her collapse, his presence serving as both comfort and inadvertent crowd control. Jake, the younger paramedic, finally couldn't contain himself any longer. As they reached the ambulance, he turned to Tom with the kind of starstruck expression that was both endearing and slightly overwhelming. "Mr. Hanks, I just wanted to say that my mom is your biggest fan. She's seen every one of your movies at least 3 times. Would it be possible to get a quick photo? I promise I won't post it anywhere if you don't want me to." Tom looked at Jake thoughtfully, then glanced at Margaret, who was listening to this exchange with growing amazement at the surreal turn her morning had taken. "Tell you what," Tom said to Jake, "why don't you focus on taking good care of Margaret here? And when we get to the hospital, if she's feeling up to it, maybe we can get a picture of all three of us together. That way your mum will know you met someone really special today." His response acknowledged Jake's request, while redirecting attention back to Margaret in a way that made her feel included rather than like an interruption to a celebrity encounter. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, though whether from gratitude, overwhelm, or the lingering effects of her medical episode was unclear. "I can't believe this is really happening," she said, as Sarah helped her settle into the ambulance. "When I woke up this morning, I was just planning to buy some groceries and maybe stop by the library. I never imagined I'd be riding in an ambulance with Tom Hanks following behind in my car." Sarah smiled as she secured Margaret's safety restraints and began connecting her to the ambulance's monitoring equipment. "In 20 years of doing this job, I've seen a lot of unusual situations, but I have to admit this is a new one for me too," she said, her professional demeanor softened by genuine warmth. "You've got quite a guardian angel looking out for you today." Tom had retrieved Margaret's car keys and was walking toward her vehicle, a modest sedan that was impeccably maintained despite being several years old. He paused to speak with Dave, the store manager, who had been hovering nearby with the conflicted expression of someone who wanted to be helpful but wasn't sure what help was needed. "Dave, Mrs. Chen had a few items in her cart. Could you hold on to them for her? She'll probably want to finish her shopping once she's feeling better." "Of course, Mr. Hanks," Dave replied, though his voice carried the slight bewilderment of someone still processing the morning's events. "And, sir, I just want you to know that what you're doing is really something special. Most people would have just called 911 and moved on with their day." Tom shook his head gently, uncomfortable with the praise. "Most people would do exactly what I'm doing, Dave. We all want to help when we see someone in need. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time." His response revealed a fundamental belief about human nature that had perhaps shaped both his choice of roles and his approach to life, the conviction that ordinary decency was more common than cynics suggested. The ambulance engine started with a low rumble, and Tom could see Margaret through the back window, still looking somewhat dazed, but significantly more alert than she had been lying on the cereal aisle floor. He waved to her and pointed to his car, miming driving motions to indicate he would be following them. Margaret's face broke into a smile, the first genuine expression of joy he had seen from her since this ordeal began. As Tom settled into Margaret's car and adjusted the seat and mirrors, he noticed the small personal touches that revealed glimpses of her life. A photograph of a middle-aged couple, presumably her children, was clipped to the sun visor. The radio was tuned to a classical music station, and a half-finished crossword puzzle lay on the passenger seat, alongside a pen and reading glasses. These details painted a picture of someone who lived a quiet, thoughtful life, someone who found pleasure in small intellectual challenges and maintained connections with family despite physical distance. The drive to Regional Medical Center took 15 minutes through streets that Tom had traveled countless times over the years, but seeing them from Margaret's car gave him a different perspective on the familiar landscape. He found himself noticing details he usually missed, the way the morning light caught the windows of the houses they passed, the careful gardens maintained by residents who took pride in their small patches of earth, the joggers and dog walkers who represented the rhythm of ordinary weekend life. At the hospital, Tom navigated the complex process of visitor parking and patient drop-off areas with the kind of patience that came from experience with institutional bureaucracy. He had spent enough time in hospitals over the years, visiting friends and family members, to understand that these places operated on their own timeline and according to their own logic. The key was to remain flexible and focus on what truly mattered, which in this case was ensuring that Margaret received proper care. The emergency department was moderately busy for a Saturday morning, filled with the usual mix of minor injuries, worried family members, and medical staff moving with purposeful efficiency. Tom approached the registration desk, carrying Margaret's purse and the small bag of personal items the paramedics had gathered, his presence causing a subtle ripple of recognition among staff and visitors, though most were too focused on their own concerns to do more than look twice. "I'm here with Margaret Chen," he told the registration clerk, a woman in her 50s whose nameplate identified her as Rosa Martinez. "She came in by ambulance about 20 minutes ago after fainting at Henderson's Market. I have her purse and keys." Rosa looked up from her computer screen with the kind of practiced professionalism that suggested she had seen everything the job could offer, including celebrity sightings. "Are you family?" Rosa asked, following standard protocol despite the unusual circumstances. When Tom shook his head, she continued, "I can hold on to her belongings, but I won't be able to give you information about her condition or treatment unless she specifically authorizes it. Patient privacy laws, you understand." Tom nodded, having expected this response. "Of course. I just want to make sure she has her things and knows that her car is safely parked." She was worried about the practical details, and I told her I'd take care of them. Rosa's expression softened as she recognized the genuine concern in his voice, the absence of any attempt to use his celebrity status to circumvent normal procedures. "Let me see what I can do," Rosa said, picking up her phone. After a brief conversation with someone in the treatment area, she looked back at Tom. "Mrs. Chen is awake and alert, and she's asking about you. The doctor says she can have one visitor for a few minutes if you'd like to see her." Tom followed Rosa through the controlled access doors that separated the emergency department's public area from its treatment spaces. The corridors were lined with examination rooms, their curtained doorways providing privacy, while allowing medical staff to move efficiently between patients. The sounds of medical equipment, muted conversations, and the occasional overhead page created the familiar symphony of a hospital in operation. Margaret was sitting up in bed in examination room 7, looking much more like herself despite the hospital gown and the IV line that had been placed in her left arm. Her color was good, and her eyes were bright with alertness, though she still appeared somewhat overwhelmed by the attention she was receiving. Her nurse was adjusting her IV pump while a doctor, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and graying hair, made notes on a tablet. "Margaret," Tom said as he entered the room, "you're looking much better. How are you feeling?" His voice carried genuine relief at seeing her obvious improvement, and Margaret's face lit up with a smile that transformed her features and erased years from her appearance. "Like I've been through quite an adventure," she replied, her voice stronger than it had been in the store. "Dr. Patterson here tells me that my blood sugar was quite low, and I was probably more dehydrated than I realized. Apparently, I've been skipping breakfast too often and not drinking enough water. Who knew that such simple things could cause so much drama?" Dr. Patterson looked up from her tablet with a smile. "Mrs. Chen has been telling me about her morning, and I have to say it's not every day that one of our patients gets a personal escort from a movie star. She's going to be fine, but we want to keep her for observation for a few hours and make sure her blood chemistry stabilizes completely." The hours that followed took on a rhythm that was both mundane and extraordinary, as Tom found himself settling into the role of temporary family member for someone he had met only hours earlier. He helped Margaret navigate the hospital's meal ordering system, sat with her during visits from various medical specialists, and served as an intermediary with the nursing staff when she was too polite to advocate for her own comfort. It was the kind of quiet, sustained caring that rarely made headlines, but revealed character in ways that grand gestures could not. During a lull between medical procedures, Margaret shared stories about her late husband Robert, their 47-year marriage, and the challenges of adjusting to life alone. Tom listened with the same attention he might give to a director explaining a complex scene, understanding instinctively that she needed to talk about these things as much as she needed medical care. Her stories painted a picture of a life lived with dignity and purpose, of small pleasures and deep commitments that had created meaning over decades. Robert always did the grocery shopping, Margaret confided as they waited for the results of her latest blood tests. He enjoyed it, said it was like solving a puzzle to find everything on my list and stay within budget. I've been doing it myself for 2 years now, but I still feel like I'm playing his role rather than finding my own way. Does that make sense? Tom nodded, understanding more than she might have expected. When we lose someone important, we have to learn not just to live without them, but to live as ourselves again, rather than as half of a couple. It takes time to figure out who we are in this new situation. There's no timeline for that kind of adjustment. His words came from experience with loss, both personal and observed, and Margaret recognized their authenticity. "You really understand," she said with surprise. "I expected you to be nice, of course. Everyone says you're one of the good ones. But I didn't expect you to understand the complicated parts." "Being famous doesn't protect you from the human experience," Tom replied simply. "We all face the same fundamental challenges, the same losses, the same need to find meaning and connection. Celebrity just means you sometimes have to deal with these things while people are watching." The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Patterson's return with test results that confirmed what they had hoped. Margaret's blood chemistry had normalized, and there were no signs of more serious underlying conditions. The fainting episode appeared to have been caused by the combination of low blood sugar, mild dehydration, and perhaps the stress of managing daily tasks that had become more challenging than she wanted to admit. "We're going to discharge you with instructions to follow up with your regular doctor next week," Dr. Patterson explained. "I'm also recommending that you consider some lifestyle adjustments, maybe eating smaller, more frequent meals, and making sure you stay well hydrated. And Mrs. Chen, there's no shame in asking for help with shopping or other tasks if you need it." Margaret nodded, though Tom could see the internal struggle between relief at the clean bill of health and resistance to acknowledging that she might need ongoing support. It was a conflict he had observed in other people he cared about as they navigated the transition from complete independence to accepting assistance with dignity. As the discharge paperwork was processed and Margaret changed back into her regular clothes, Tom found himself thinking about the strange trajectory of the day. He had entered Henderson's Market as a private citizen, seeking the simple pleasure of selecting his own produce, and he was leaving the hospital as someone who had become genuinely invested in the well-being of a woman he had never met before this morning. "Tom," Margaret said as they prepared to leave the hospital, "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done today. You've been kinder to me than some people I've known for years." "I feel like I should do something to show my appreciation, but I have no idea what would be appropriate." Tom smiled, the same genuine expression that had carried him through decades of public life. "Margaret, you don't need to thank me or do anything to show appreciation. Today you reminded me why I love people, why I believe in the importance of showing up for each other. If anything, I should be thanking you." The drive back to Henderson's Market gave them both time to process the extraordinary events of the morning and begin the transition back to normal life. Margaret sat in the passenger seat of her own car, still somewhat amazed that Tom Hanks was driving her vehicle while she recovered from a medical emergency. The afternoon sun was warmer now, casting longer shadows across the suburban landscape and creating the kind of golden light that photographers and cinematographers prize for its flattering qualities. "I keep thinking about what you said earlier, about being connected now instead of being strangers," Margaret said as they pulled into the market's parking lot. "I've been feeling so disconnected since Robert died, like I was just going through the motions of living without really participating in life. Today feels like the first time in months that I've felt truly present in my own experience." Tom parked the car carefully in the same spot where Margaret had left it that morning, a small gesture of returning things to their proper order. "Sometimes it takes an unexpected event to wake us up to possibilities we hadn't considered," he replied. "Maybe this is your reminder that there are still adventures to be had, still connections to be made, even when we think we have life figured out." Dave, the store manager, had been watching for their return and approached the car with a mixture of relief and continued amazement at finding himself part of such an unusual story. He carried a small bag containing the items from Margaret's abandoned shopping cart, along with a bouquet of flowers that he had selected from the store's floral department. "Mrs. Chen, we're all so glad you're okay," he said as she got out of the car, "and please consider these groceries on the house today. It's the least we can do." Margaret accepted the flowers with tears in her eyes, touched by the kindness of people who had been strangers a few hours earlier. "You've all been so wonderful," she managed to say. "I came here this morning feeling like I was just getting through another day, and I'm leaving feeling like I've been reminded what it means to be part of a community." Inside the store, word of the morning's events had spread among staff and regular customers, creating an atmosphere of gentle celebration rather than invasive curiosity. Several employees approached Margaret to express their concern and relief, and a few long-time customers who had seen the ambulance that morning stopped to check on her well-being. Tom observed these interactions with satisfaction, seeing the evidence of the caring community that existed in ordinary places like Henderson's Market. Jake, the young paramedic who had requested a photo earlier, appeared near the customer service desk with his mother, a woman in her 60s whose eyes widened with recognition when she saw Tom. "Mom," Jake said proudly, "this is Mr. Hanks, and this is Mrs. Chen, the lady we helped today. Mr. Hanks said we could get that picture now if everyone's feeling up to it." The photo session that followed was brief but joyful, with Margaret insisting that she wanted to be included in every shot. "If I'm going to be part of this story," she declared with newfound confidence, "I want there to be evidence that I was here." The pictures captured something authentic and spontaneous, the genuine smiles of people who had shared an experience that connected them across the usual boundaries of age, fame, and circumstance. As they prepared to part ways, Tom and Margaret exchanged contact information, though both understood that their connection might remain as a beautiful, self-contained memory rather than the beginning of an ongoing friendship. "I want you to know," Tom said, "that meeting you today has been a gift. You've reminded me why I choose to believe in the goodness of people and the importance of showing up when someone needs help." Margaret looked at him with the clarity that sometimes comes after a crisis, when people see themselves and their situation with unusual honesty. "Tom, you saved me today in more ways than one, not just from fainting in a grocery store, but from the feeling that I didn't matter to anyone anymore. You've given me back a sense of my own worth and reminded me that there are still kind people in the world who care about strangers." They hugged goodbye in the parking lot, a gesture that felt both natural and significant. As Tom walked to his own car, which had sat patiently in the lot throughout the morning's drama, he reflected on the unpredictability of life and the importance of remaining open to unexpected encounters. He had come to the store seeking apples and anonymity, and he was leaving with a renewed appreciation for the small heroisms that ordinary people perform for each other every day. Margaret stood beside her car for a moment, watching Tom drive away with a wave and a smile that seemed to contain all the warmth and authenticity that had made him beloved by millions of people who had never met him. Then she gathered her flowers and groceries and walked toward her own car with steps that seemed lighter and more purposeful than they had been in months. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward evening as Margaret drove home, her usual route transformed by the day's experiences into something that looked different, more full of possibility than it had that morning. She thought about the phone calls she would make to her children, the story she would tell at her book club, and the follow-up doctor's appointment that no longer seemed like an admission of weakness, but rather a commitment to taking good care of herself. When she pulled into her driveway, Margaret sat in the car for an extra moment, savoring the knowledge that she had survived something that could have been much worse and had been reminded of her own resilience and worth. The house that had sometimes felt too quiet and empty now seemed like a sanctuary where she could process the day's gifts and plan for whatever adventures might come next. That evening, as news of the day's events began to spread through social media and entertainment news outlets, the story would be framed as another example of Tom Hanks being America's most decent celebrity. But for Margaret, sitting in her living room with her flowers and her memories, the story was about something larger, the reminder that we are all connected to each other in ways we cannot predict, and that kindness offered and received can transform ordinary moments into something extraordinary. She fell asleep that night with a smile on her face, grateful for grocery store aisles and movie stars and paramedics and flowers, but mostly grateful for the discovery that even at 72, after loss and loneliness and the challenges of starting over, she was still capable of being surprised by joy. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If you enjoyed this story and appreciate this kind of content, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss upcoming videos and more fascinating stories. Until next time.